Hello, Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. I am your host. I'm so happy to be here. And today we have another episode in my Reclaiming What is Hard series. Now, if you're new to the podcast or new to the series, before I became a licensed psychotherapist, I was a depth-oriented coach for almost a decade. So I have seen, I've taught, I have explored many ideas around the complexities of being human. And in this podcast, I hope to offer ways of thinking differently about popular concepts so that you can figure out what's going to be most supportive for you. Every episode, I reclaim one topic. And today I want to pick up where I left off in my new series called Reclaiming What is Hard. There are a lot of difficult parts about being human, and all those things tend to revolve around feelings that arise within us that are hard to tolerate. Feelings that we have been taught to never feel, feelings that we have been told are bad, feelings that now, when they come up, overwhelm, paralyze, and collapse us. And so I want to break down some of these difficult feelings, shed light on what they may mean, and explore different ways of thinking and relating to them so that we may find wisdom in what is hard. You know, there's this famous Buddhist quote that says, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. I sometimes take that to mean that the hard stuff will inevitably come up during our time here on this planet. But what we make of it, how we relate to it, can make a huge difference. So that's what this series is all about, expanding our ability to relate to difficult internal experiences. And today we're talking about embarrassment. Something we all feel, something we all experience. What is embarrassment? Why do some of us seek out embarrassment or humiliation? Why, for some of us, is embarrassment so debilitating that it prevents us from dating or putting ourselves out there or asking for a promotion? What's going on there? And how can we maybe think and relate to embarrassment so that it creates more space for us to do the things that we want to do in our lives? So let's get into it. Before I get into the conversation about embarrassment, I just want to name that last week was my 8-year anniversary of Reclaim the Podcast. 8 years of running this podcast. It means so much to me that you're here, that you're listening. Maybe you've been here at the beginning where my focus was really more on the intersection of spirituality and social justice. Maybe you just started tuning in more recently when I've shifted the kind of focus of my podcast to be a way that we start to interrogate pop psych terms, pop psych ideas, and bring more depth-oriented psychoanalytic experiences and perspectives to the cultural zeitgeist. However long you've been listening to the podcast, I'm so appreciative. This project has been an undertaking of a century. It is really a project where it has forced me to encounter so many of my most painful internal wounds around visibility, being seen, putting myself out there. And every time I get an email from one of you or a comment on YouTube or on Spotify, letting me know how this podcast lands for you, I feel so honored and so touched. In the world where there's so much vying for our attention, and we are trying so hard to reclaim our attention and trying to be really thoughtful of where we put our attention. The fact that you are logging in and listening to this podcast means the world to me. So thank you so much for being here. I did recently share some of my more difficult learnings about my podcast on my email list. If you're not on my email list, you can join. There's a link below. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can go to thaissky.com/email. Or you can go to my show notes and get the link there. And, you know, the email, I'm so ambivalent about emails because on the one hand, I personally don't really like receiving a lot of emails. And so I try to be really thoughtful about what type of information I send to you. But at the same time, I know that many of you want to stay in touch. And with the algorithms, there's such a gamble of whether or not you will see my stuff on Instagram or here on YouTube. So signing up for my email list is kind of the best way that you can be assured to get consistent, well, I can't say that I'm consistent, but occasional meanderings from me, as well as my latest offerings and updates. And so go to thaissky.com/email if you want to get on my list. I know I didn't sell it that well, but thank you again for being here. I do have a few openings actually in some of the groups that I run. And so if you want to know more about working together, I have a group for women who struggle with self-worth, women who want to cultivate the kind of inner capacities and the relational skills to be more of themselves in the relationships that matter. Whether you're struggling with feeling like you lose yourself in your relationships, or your anger and frustration keeps people far away from you, this group may be a supportive environment for you to kind of work through, learn, understand in real time what goes on for you in these difficult dynamics so that you can cultivate more intimacy and closeness and emotional honesty in your life. You can go to my website, thaissky.com/group to learn more. I also have spaces available in the 2 mentorship groups that I run. One, it's for coaches who want a more depth-oriented lens in their work, who want the type of supervision and support in their coaching skills, and who also want to grow a real sustainable, long-lasting, enduring coaching practice. If you love coaching, but you feel stuck on how to market yourself, or if you love coaching, but you find that when you sit in front of somebody, you don't know what to do because so much of these coaching programs, these business programs are built towards how to build a business, but not really built towards how to cultivate the coaching skills so you can meet people where they're at. If you're wanting both of those things in one ongoing mentorship container, you can learn more by going to thaissky.com/mentorship. I have one space available. And then I have a group that I'm just now developing for psychoanalytic psychotherapists who want to grow their professional identity. I see in my supervision with my associate, my intern, that there is such a desire for spaces where we can not only talk about our work psychoanalytically, understand, cultivate our kind of clinical capacities and mindset, but also how do we understand our practice from a business perspective? How do we grow our private practice so that it's sustainable for us? How do we grow if we want to do online marketing, or if we want to write papers, or if we want to do a podcast, if we want to grow our voice beyond just the consulting room? There's not a lot of support out there for people like us, and that is why I created this mentorship. We get the psychoanalytic conversations, the clinical implications, but we also get the business side of things. How do we grow something that's really oriented towards the vision that we have for ourselves and our work? And to learn more, you can go to thaissky.com/business-mentorship, or just go to thaissky.com. All of my groups are there. You can learn more about all of my offerings, including my individual work and my work with couples. Okay. So now that I've gotten all of those housekeeping things out of the way, let's start talking about embarrassment. Now, this topic is so interesting to me because I don't really struggle with embarrassment. It's not something that really debilitates me. And so I never would have really thought to focus on a whole episode on embarrassment. But then I received a question from a listener asking me to talk about this. And when I read her email, it really struck me how often embarrassment can be so debilitating. While we know that it's something that probably all of us experience, for some of us, we experience it more than others. And when we are so worried about feeling embarrassed, it can really prevent us from doing the things that we want to do, from developing new relationships, putting ourselves out there for promotion, taking risks. So much of risk taking, of building a business, for example, or creating a new project like a podcast, you're going to confront feelings of being cringy, being embarrassed, being judged. And if it is so debilitating, if our fear of how other people experience us prevents us from doing these things, well, there's an opportunity there, right, for us to then think a little bit more deeply about what may be going on for us. And so that's what this episode is going to be all about. Let's think about embarrassment from a depth-oriented perspective. Let's think about what may be going on for us so that maybe we can hold our embarrassment a little bit differently. And then I was thinking about this podcast and embarrassment. And I know I just said to you, I don't experience it often. There is one moment that comes to mind pretty recently where I got together with a bunch of friends for one of my really good friends' birthday. And I made a really dark joke that maybe would have been appropriate if it had been just me and him and my husband. But it was with his family. It was with all of our friends and their children. There was a lot of age discrepancies, age differences in that group, and my joke did not land. In fact, the response I got from a lot of people was like, "Ooh, yikes, I can't believe you said that." And oh my gosh, did I feel mortified. And why did I say that? I found myself getting so tripped up about what was I thinking to have said that in that moment in time. And while we can always wonder, why did I say that? What may have been going on for me on another level? I wasn't asking that question out of a place of curiosity. I was asking that question in myself out of a lot of self-loathing and a real desire that if I experience enough self-loathing, if I hate myself enough, maybe I can somehow undo the damage that I had done. And so with that experience in mind, let's think about what is embarrassment, what may be going on for us there, and how can we start to think about it a little bit differently? Because while embarrassment is like one of those feelings that maybe we don't take that seriously as a culture, it can reveal actually so much about our relationship to ourselves, to others, and how we are experiencing another person on like their gaze, right? Their experience of us. It can be quite debilitating. And so, I like to think of embarrassment and so many of these other difficult emotions that I'm covering on this series as a doorway into some deeper truths about our dependence on others and about our vulnerability in being seen. Now, to start us off, we have to define embarrassment. I like to distinguish it by first exploring its difference between something like shame and guilt, because I think they tend to come up, they tend to be intertwined, they tend to come up together. But differentiating them, I think, may be helpful for us. Like I talked about in my episode on shame, which I'll link in the show notes for you if you want to catch that episode. Shame is a sense of I am bad. I'm a bad person. The self of us, our selfhood feels bad, whatever bad means. There's something really wrong with me, right? I am bad. That's shame. Guilt, on the other hand, is more like our conscience feels bad, like I did something bad. I messed up in some significant way, and we start to feel really guilty. I shouldn't have done that, right? So that's guilt. Embarrassment is the ego feeling exposed. Like I've been seen in a way that I didn't intend. When I Googled the definition of embarrassment, I got a feeling of self-consciousness, of shame or awkwardness. And that really does not, I don't think that really captures it, because I don't think that embarrassment and shame is the same thing. Again, I think they do go hand in hand. I think they are often intertwined, but there's a slightly different flavor to embarrassment, where you feel exposed, you feel seen, you feel like other people are judging you or experiencing you in a way that grates against your experience of yourself or your experience of how you want to be perceived. A lot of embarrassment is really about perception. It's how you are being seen, how you're being held in someone else's mind. And so the interesting thing about embarrassment is that it often happens in a social interaction. It's very rarely that we experience embarrassment in isolation, unless we are evoking we think someone else is going to be thinking of us as we did that. So how I may feel embarrassed that I accidentally spilled my cup of coffee only because I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what would my boss think if he saw me right now? But if I did not imagine anyone seeing this, I probably won't feel embarrassed for having spilled my cup of coffee. So we can think of embarrassment as a state of feeling foolish in front of others, feeling exposed in front of others, that we did something that we imagine other people are going to judge us for. So there's an important component there of embarrassment, which is that we experience others unkindly. There is a massive difference in our experience if we fall in front of people and the people's reaction to it is, oh my God, you're such a klutz. Right now, we probably not only will feel embarrassed, but we're probably also going to be moving into a sense of humiliation, because now other people are mocking us. There's an ill intent that people are speaking to us, right? So there's embarrassment. We're probably feeling some humiliation. But let's say we fall and the first person that's, responds says something with a lot of love, like, oh my gosh, are you okay? Now we may still feel embarrassed, but maybe we now feel a little bit less on the spectrum towards humiliation and more towards the spectrum of feeling silly or feeling a little dumb, feeling a little exposed, right? So again, the feeling of embarrassment is a social experience. It's dynamic between parties. It's not just happening internally. And this is important because so many times we start to feel very judgmental for why we have certain feelings, because we experience our feelings as happening inside of us independently of what's happening outside of us. Like our feelings are just here in ourselves. But so many of our feelings is actually an interchange between us and somebody else, whether it's a perceived other, an imagined other, or an actual other. So much of feeling, so much of the experience of a feeling is actually a communication between multiple people. It's not just happening independently of other people. It is connected deeply to other people. And embarrassment tells us a lot about how we have been experienced by others and experience others. And that's going to help us to understand a little bit more deeply when we think about why do we feel so embarrassed so often. Is that we are having an experience of other people's minds. It's not a solely within ourselves. It's connected to our experience of other people. So we can think about it as like a social affect. It's an emotion that requires an imagined or real other who sees us in a way that we don't like. It is often fleeting, right? Embarrassment is often a fleeting emotion, but it's deeply formative, especially for those with early histories of being ridiculed, unseen, or overly scrutinized, which we'll talk a little bit more about. One thing that is interesting when I Googled, why do we feel so embarrassed all the time, or what can we do to feel less embarrassed? There was the answers often came intertwined with this idea of confidence. That if you feel confident in yourself, you may not feel as embarrassed. And I think that that's really interesting, that there is an intertwined quality of embarrassment and a sense of security in oneself, a sense of confidence in oneself. So there's some kind of key aspects of embarrassment, right? You become self-conscious, meaning you become acutely aware of yourself, right? And your actions in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable, makes you feel exposed in some way, right? There's an awkwardness and a level of distress that often happens when we feel embarrassed, right? We feel kind of flustered, confused. We feel generally uneasy about the situation. We immediately wish that we could revoke, we could undo. We fall in front of a colleague, and now we imagine that they see us in a way that makes us feel really, really out of control, right? There's, of course, this kind of perceived sense of like a social failure where you believe that you violated a social norm, or failed to meet some expectations, right? Which could negatively impact how people view you. And then I think we become very worried about the social ramifications. Will we be ostracized? I think a lot of embarrassment for many of us is really intertwined with a sense of feeling rejected or feeling cast out, feeling abandoned in a social setting. And of course, if we think biologically, just how wired we are for connection and belonging, for our survival, embarrassment makes a lot of sense on a biological level. There has to be some sort of inner construct that keeps us in line, so to speak. And this is, Freud is very fascinated by this, which we'll talk about in a minute. So again, there's a perceived social failure. And the reason why perceived is important is because, embarrassment sometimes makes sense in the setting that we're in, but so much of our feelings of embarrassment is actually something in the past making its way known now. Because it may not even make sense. We may know that the people that we just embarrass ourselves in front of loves us. And yet we still feel this way. We feel like we failed, even though logically we may know that no one is judging us that as hard as we're judging ourselves. I made that really bad joke in front of my group of friends, but these are people who have known me for many, many years. And they know that sometimes I put, my foot in my mouth, right? And it hasn't cast me out yet. And yet I experienced it as, oh my God, this was a massive failing and everything now is going to fall apart as a result. That's an important part of the kind of experience of embarrassment. What's interesting about embarrassment, though, is that it's not always a negative thing. Sometimes we feel embarrassed by a compliment, by being called beautiful, by being called out for our work celebration. A friend could have seen that you succeeded in something and shared it in a group text, and we may feel embarrassed, and it was a positive thing. And that's really interesting. Again, it's a sense of feeling exposed in a way that we didn't consent to. Because even though it's good, we're getting a compliment, we then don't imagine that other people really think of it as good. We imagine that they are now going to judge us, they're going to envy us, they're going to destroy us. Now, a kind of key facet of embarrassment, I think that can help differentiate from shame, is that it's often temporary and it is often mild. Again, there's like maybe a spectrum that we can think about embarrassment. It's not quite as intense as humiliation, because again, I think humiliation, there's an added piece of other people wanting you to feel devalued. It's often fleeting, but again, the fear of embarrassment can actually be very debilitating. So even though the embarrassment feeling in it of itself may be temporary, the experience, the fear of it, the ramifications of it can feel very permanent. So what's going on for us here? Why do we feel embarrassed? Of course, when I start to wonder, what is the origins of this? Why do some of us are so sensitive to people's perception of us and feel so out of control when we experience other people perceiving us in a way that we don't want? What's really happening there? Of course, I start to go towards psychoanalytic theories. Psychoanalysis is a robust philosophy and way of trying to understand the human experience in its root cause. It's what gravitated me towards psychoanalytic psychotherapy. I want to get to the root. I want to know what's going on there. I always struggled with science. I remember in middle school, elementary school, high school, learning about biology, learning about the cells, learning about the nucleus, right? And learning that like electrons rotate around the nucleus or whatever. And I wondered, well, why? Why does it do that? And I could not get any satisfactory answers because there is so much of science that we really don't know. And instead of that leading me to be like, oh, well, I want to be a scientist because I want to know and discover why that is, I just got frustrated. I couldn't handle the possibility that like we don't know and yet we're drawing these massive conclusions. And so it doesn't surprise me that I went towards psychoanalytic therapy because psychoanalysis is really oriented towards trying to understand what is happening at the core. What happened to us? What did we experience that is now leading us to feel this way? And that, of course, that's not all of what we do in a psychoanalytic treatment, but it is the theory and the philosophy of it can give us some really interesting answers. And so I went into my research to just try to discover, well, what does psychoanalysis say about embarrassment? And the first thing that I thought of was Winnicott's The Capacity to Be Alone. Now, I explored this more in my episode on loneliness, which I will put the links in the show notes. It's another Reclaiming What Is Hard series episode. Of like, why is it that some of us can feel okay being alone without collapsing into a deep despair of loneliness, while others, right, really, really struggle with this? What happened there? Now, Winnicott theorized that a hallmark of psychic maturity is our ability to be alone while in the presence of a reliable other. He imagined, he was a child psychologist, and he really looked at children's behavior. And he looked at the children that were able to play alone in the room with another and what that did for a child's development. And he theorized that there is something really important about the ability, about the experience that a caregiver can offer a child when the child is playing alone and the caregiver is attuned and responsive in the room, but not impinging or overwhelming. So the child can play, and if he wants to evoke the parent's attention, he can, and then the parent will give the attention. But if the child doesn't want the parent to play in the game, the parent doesn't play in the game, but that parent can be in awe or can observe or can delight in the child's play. In that scenario, Winnicott theorized that what happens for a child there is that they start to internalize, they start to bring in that caring other into their mind psychically, so that in the future, as an adult, that child, as he grow up, can now imagine that there's a kind, delighted other inside of themselves, even when they're alone. So they're alone physically, but they're not alone psychically. Psychically, there's a kind, empathic, attuned parent that they can lean on, that they can support, again, in their own minds. It's this idea that we often bring up in psychoanalytic conversation of how are we held in mind by another person? If you just see a person in the world, you just see them right there, standing there, what do we imagine they're thinking and feeling about us? Whatever we imagine that they're seeing about us tells us a whole lot about how someone else related to us and saw us when we were younger. Now we are projecting, we haven't said anything, but we are projecting a whole lot onto that person by imagining what they're thinking and feeling. Now, we try to get around this. So many of us try to get around this by saying, I don't know what they're thinking. I don't know what they're feeling. But then we act and we relate to this stranger in ways that actually reveal that on some level, we think we know what they're thinking and feeling. Yes? We treat them rudely, for example, or we ignore them. Maybe we're doing that because on some level, we imagine that they hate us. Or the possibilities are endless. But this is what Winnicott means when he thinks about this idea of the capacity to be alone. The kind of presence of a reliable other now gets internal. It's now inside of ourselves. And so we hold ourselves differently now when we are alone. The reason why I connected this with embarrassment is, again, we talk about embarrassment, right, as intertwined with this idea of feeling exposed to another. We feel like there's another mind that is looking at what we just did, and they are judging us. They are evaluating us in a way that we do not like. Why are we imagining that they are doing that? Sure, there may be some of it that's rooted in a truth. Maybe we know them enough to know that they hate us or that they would judge us. But oftentimes, it's really not as much about what's real and more about what we experience of them, what we project onto their mind. And if we lack this kind of reliable other inside of ourselves that we can call on, we may start to imagine that other people are actually judging us. And therein is our experience of embarrassment. Yes? So those who didn't experience kind of this sufficient attuned witnessing, as when it, may oscillate between craving visibility, like wanting to be seen, and really dreading it. And being seen can then oftentimes feel dangerous, as though the gaze of the other will intrude or humiliate rather than hold. Because imagine if you're playing, and every time you play, your parent is there criticizing, why are you doing that? You shouldn't be doing that. Why did you just connect those two things? That's wrong. God, you're so stupid. Why would you put the round block in the square hole? Why are you doing it that way? Or they may immediately impinge in the game and start doing it their way. No, you should be playing this way. This is how you should be doing this. When we experience that over and over and over again, we internalize that the other person, that this mind, is judging us and is experiencing us in a way that is unkind to us. So in that way, right, embarrassment can be thought of as signal affect. It's a sign that the psyche is brushing up against the limits of what it can tolerate in terms of exposure and authenticity. So I thought Winnicott, could help us here in understanding embarrassment. But after reading and thinking about this capacity to be alone, I still felt really like there was something really missing. So I had to go towards, let's go all the way to the beginning. Let's go to Freud and see what Freud thought about all this, because so much of Freud's conception of the id and the ego and the superego, I think, is a way that he attempted to organize the experience of embarrassment. So Freud, I think, would say that embarrassment, really, the feeling of embarrassment reveals a moment of self-surveillance when the ego realizes it has fallen short of its ego ideal. Uh-oh, right? What happens when the ego, our sense of who we are, our awareness of ourselves, realizes it's fallen short of who it wants us to be, the ego ideal, right? The superego, which is the internalized observer, suddenly catches us in our own failure. Yeah. So Freud viewed embarrassment as tied to a sense of exposure before an internalized authority. It's as though the gaze of the other, that is now internal, turns towards us in judgment. Yeah. So embarrassment then is thus a moral and an aesthetic affect. We feel we violated not only a rule, but an image, the idealized self-presentation that we strive to maintain. So in moments of embarrassment, we split into two kind of psychic positions, the one who is acting and the one who is watching the actor. And the internal double vision can become profoundly unsettling. And there's the experience of embarrassment, right? So repeated experiences of a harsh superego can make embarrassment intolerable, leading to a lot of defensive strategies, withdrawals, counterattack, and shamelessness, which we're going to talk about more in a bit. But that's where maybe the superego's gaze is denied or projected outward. Okay, so interesting. Now we're starting to really get somewhere. In Freud's tripartite model of the mind. He divided the personality, the psyche, into 3 interacting parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is, in his mind, the unconscious, pleasure-seeking part driven by basic instincts. We can think about this as like the most primitive parts of us, yeah? That just wants pleasure, that just wants release of frustration. That's the id. Then we have the ego, the rational, realistic parts, or the sense of self, or our understanding of who we are. And there, the ego, according to Freud, mediated between the id and the superego, operating on the reality principle. The superego, right, is the moral component that internalizes societal and parental standards, striving for perfection and imposing guilt. So the superego is responsible for this idea of being the inner critic, right? Or being super critical of ourselves in an attempt to keep us from just going nuts, right? Like totally losing ourselves, according to Freud. Yes? Well, and so the ego's responsibility here is to kind of try to oscillate between the two. Now, if we understand this tripartite model, then embarrassment is a way that the superego tries to get the id back in line. Yes? So again, when the ego realizes it's fallen short of its ego ideal, the superego catches us in that failure. And embarrassment is evoked to try to get us back in line. That's an interesting theory. I kind of like that theory. I can kind of see how that can help us understand embarrassment. Again, I think in more simplistic terms, I think about embarrassment as we have certain rules for ourselves, a certain understanding of who we are in the world. And when we fall short of that, embarrassment comes in to try to tell us, you're being exposed. That's not right. I think the most helpful thing that we can think about, at least in terms of like Freud's theory of all this, is that embarrassment reveals to us the internalized gaze of the other, that there is something inside of us that is watching us. And embarrassment is the feeling when our ego realizes that we failed to live up to our internal ideal. We may not know this. We may not know that like we have had this internal ideal until we experience embarrassment. We feel embarrassed and then we realize, oh, I want to be perceived as funny, or oh, I don't want to be perceived as messy. I don't want to be perceived as klutzy. I don't want to be perceived as unkind or uncompassionate. Again, thinking about my joke, right? And so in that moment of embarrassment, we become both the performer and the audience. We catch ourselves in the act of failing who we want to be. That gives us some insight into the importance of embarrassment, because it's telling us that there is some ideal that we're not living up to, that we may not even known that we were trying to live up to. And if we can explore that a little bit more deeply, then we can examine whether or not that's even an ideal that we are really committed to living up to or not. So that's I think what's helpful about thinking about embarrassment through the tripartite model of Freud is to just realize that embarrassment it shows us a gap. There's a difference between how we want to be and how we are, and wondering, well, where did we get this idea of who we want to be? What's going on there for us? Was that consensual? Are we really choosing who we want to be? Or is there some unconscious desire, unconscious wish for ourselves that we haven't examined? That's why I think Freud is interesting here. But I don't know. I often struggle with feeling like, but that doesn't really touch, I think, on the ways in which embarrassment can feel so exposing. What's going on there? And so now I look to Kohut. So Kohut was known for his development of self-psychology, an influential school of thought that really focused on the narcissistic psychopathology. And I think narcissism really can give us a lot of insight into embarrassment, because when we're talking about narcissism, we're not talking about it, I think, from the more pop psych idea of narcissism, where everyone's a narcissist if they're toxic, but really how we all have narcissistic traits. We all have narcissistic injuries and wounds. We all have ways in which we are really oriented towards the self in a way that feels very defensive. And if you want to know more about narcissism, I recorded a really wonderful podcast with Meredith Redding, who's a dear friend, all about it. So I'm going to link it in the show notes for you. And we explain more about what we exactly mean when we're talking about narcissism. But from a Kohut perspective, embarrassment can be understood as a narcissistic injury. And that, to me, that fits my experience of embarrassment, where it's a moment when the image we hold of ourselves or wish others to see, right, suddenly falls apart. This grandiose self, this perfect self, this idea of who I want to be, the inner structure built to sustain a sense of specialness, of competence, of perfection, momentarily collapses under the weight of a reality, of a sliver of reality. What makes embarrassment so charged is that it's rarely about the external event itself. Someone laughs at our mistake or we stumble over our words, but the emotion that floods us far exceeds the situation. That type of embarrassment, what we're really reacting to, right, according to Kohut, is this collapse of a cohesive self. It's a sudden loss of an internal mirror that says, you're good, you're admirable, you're a good person. Now suddenly it's collapsed and we feel like, oh my God, I am not who I thought I was. I am not a kind person if I can make that type of crass joke. Now, when we think about why that, for some of us, that happens more often, we collapse more often internally whenever, we feel embarrassed a lot. We can think about it, early environments where we did not receive kind of consistent empathic mirroring. We didn't have caregivers who could recognize and reflect their aliveness, our aliveness, without distorting. When we don't have that, when, again, going back to Winnicott, a presence of another inside of us that can say, you're okay, you're good, you're special, you're amazing. If we lack that, what inner resource do we have in these failed moments, in these mistakes? And that's why it can feel so annihilating, right? Because the self momentarily disintegrates because there's no kind of reliable inner structures, no kind other inside of ourselves that can hold the shame. And so in that sense, embarrassment is not just a social discomfort, it's an echo of an earlier failure of attunement. Kohut would say that embarrassment signals a breakdown in the self-object function, the surrounding empathic environment that helps us feel coherent and real. When a self-object function fails, even briefly, our sense of self becomes brittle, and we experience the brittleness as humiliation or shame. But when embarrassment is met with empathy, it can be a site of repair. When someone, a therapist, a friend, a partner, can stay connected to us through the embarrassment, rather than turning away or trying to fix it, we begin to internalize a new kind of experience, a new kind of mirroring, and that kind of once fragmented self learns it can survive exposure and even grow from it. It was so healing for me in that moment when I made the bad joke and everyone's like, ooh, yikes, can't believe you said that. For my partner to come up to me like, that happens to me all the time. And I hate that just happened to you. But like, it feels so good to know that like, it happens to all of us and I'm here in it with you, Like he didn't try to say like, yeah, that was an okay joke because it wasn't. It wasn't. But he was able to say, that's always me. I'm the one making those types of jokes. And it feels nice to know that like I'm not the only one. And that this is survivable. We're going to get through it. This happens all the time. So for Kohut, right, embarrassment can feel annihilating because it reactivates these early narcissistic wounds, these early times of terror of being seen as small, as ridiculous, as not enough. Again, if we were ridiculed quite often, or if we were met with a lot of perfectionism, like you have to be perfect, then embarrassment, we start to feel very fragile about who we are in the world. And we really try to project ourselves to be very competent, very capable, very perfect as a way to defend against these narcissistic injuries and these kind of senses of feeling not good enough. And of course, embarrassment is a flaw in that plan. And that's why it can feel so particularly painful. And again, if you want to know more about even this idea of a narcissistic injury or wounding, go check out that episode on narcissism. It is so good. Okay, and then I have one final theorist that, I think can help us to just remember something about embarrassment, and that is Bion. When I think of Bion, I often think about how certain feelings can feel really unthinkable. We dissociate, we move away, we experience shame, we freeze, we when we feel embarrassed, we want to immediately run away, right? It can be really, really hard to bear. And when we can't really think about it or talk about it, when we can't even imagine, we can't go back to that moment in our minds, it starts to get really stuck. And I tend to think about Beyond and his continual invitation that it's really important for us to find ways to metabolize the embarrassment. And we do that by talking about it. Instead of like letting the shame of it take over and trying to push it away and then not think about it, can we talk about it? Can we name it? Can we say afterwards to our friend, oh my gosh, I felt so embarrassed when I fell? And can we like think more deeply about it in ourselves? Like what was going on for me? What did I imagine other people think of me? Like why am I imagining that other people really hate? What is my experience of another mind? That I'm imagining it, it's really persecutory. What's going on there for me? When we can think more about things, things start to move through us. Therapy and life, it offers us a chance to transform something like embarrassment from just an affect that's unbearable into thinking, into a thought, to be with it rather than escape it. And that's a nice reminder from Beyond there. So why are some people especially sensitive to embarrassment? I know that I've hinted at it, but of course, early ridicule, early humiliation. If we were kind of always laughed at, shamed for our mistakes, having our emotional life be punished. Of course, now we're going to imagine that other people are laughing at us, are experiencing us in a very devaluing way. And so, of course, we're going to feel embarrassed because, again, who we want to be and who we think other people experience of us, if there's a discrepancy, right, we're going to start to feel something there. If there was like a lot of overly controlling or perfectionistic expectations on us where any error was punished or was very dangerous to the relationship, if you couldn't make a mistake without the possibility of rejection, right, then we're now going to experience any of our mistakes with a lot more weight. If there was a lot of parentification, like you were really treated like you had to be a little adult and like a precocious competence, right? Like especially like older children, like the oldest child or the only child that was treated as an adult. We kind of learned that to be a baby or to be needy or to be messy or awkward is bad because you need to be competent and capable and an adult. That also may lead now to a lot of feelings of embarrassment. If our parents kind of related to us as like a narcissistic extension, if there was like a high narcissistic investment in our parents for us to be a reflection of them, then of course our self-image is going to be very brittle because it's not really built on our own sense of self, but in trying to protect someone else's sense of self. And if our worth is now tied to someone else's image, it's going to be very hard for us to confront our own messiness and other people's perceptions of us. And then, like I said, when I was talking about Kohut, if there was like a chronic lack of feeling really mirrored or feeling really attuned, feeling like someone's really there to make sense of our emotions with us, when self-esteem regulation, right, depends entirely on other people's reactions, well, then embarrassment tends to hit like a collapse of oneself. Yeah. And so, of course, when we are very sensitive to feel embarrassed, we often defend against it in a lot of different ways. We use humor, deflection, intellectualization, right? We'll always try to kind of cover the sense of feeling really exposed. We may withdraw or avoid. We may try to never take risks again or never speak up or like leave the party or like just like and the really tricky thing when we avoid is that it kind of freezes time. If we leave a party right after we fell and the last image we have is like of people smiling at us, they may be smiling for all sorts of different things and all sorts of different reasons, but we don't know those reasons. And then we withdraw. We now have frozen our experience to that moment. And it then makes it actually a lot harder for us to work through the feeling versus, let's say, if we stayed. And if we had stayed, we may have found out that they were laughing because they get it, because they've experienced it, or because they're empathizing and they're laughing at themselves and their own fault. There's like all sorts of other things that may have been happening for them that we're depriving ourselves of kind of that working through. It's a really tricky thing about avoidance. is that the avoidance, it freezes things, and then it keeps replaying in our minds. It's so hard to work through things if we're not letting ourselves stay engaged in what's happening. Other ways that we defend against embarrassment, of course, is through perfectionism, through control. We try to control other people. If we're really afraid of being embarrassed and we're dating, we may feel like we have to control the other person. They can't embarrass, they can't humiliate us. Stop doing that. Look how you make me look by doing that, right? We're kind of constantly trying to preserve our self-image because it's feeling very brittle. And so we try to control our environment or control other people so that we don't feel embarrassed or shame or humiliation. Of course, projection. We can use projection as a way to defend against our own embarrassment, like shaming other people to manage our own fear of humiliation, right? And then, of course, there's the narcissistic defense of turning against oneself, going into a lot of contempt towards oneself or a lot of self-loathing. That's a way that we are actually trying to defend against the embarrassment. We're saying that feeling is intolerable, so I'm going to self-loathe enough so I never make this mistake again. And that just doesn't work, because embarrassment and messiness is just part of the human experience. Now, in therapy, for us therapists, embarrassment is actually a really vital affect. It's a sign that the patient's kind of real self is emerging. When a patient blushes, stumbles, feels awkward, I tend to see it as something really authentic is surfacing, is about to come up. When a patient says, I don't know what to talk about today, they're making themselves vulnerable to not having prepared something, to something to get exposed. And there's something very fragile and sensitive and alive in these moments. And so it's important as a therapist that we really know how to hold the patient in that moment with a sense of curiosity and non-judgment. In that way, we're kind of teaching our patients that embarrassment can be survived, and that it, in some ways, becomes an evidence of growth, right? That you're no longer hiding behind this perfect image. You're taking risks to get a little bit messy. And I love that. I think that that's such a vital way that we're starting to brush up against the ways in which we think we have to be. Because that's the problem with when we have too strong superegos or too strong inner critics, is that we actually live in a very brittle way internally. We can't create a real sense of security within ourselves if we're so scared of anything happening is going to destroy our self-cohesion, I do want to briefly mention a little bit about the opposite of embarrassment, right? The sense of feeling shameless. We say that sometimes, like, you're so shameless. Like, why aren't you embarrassed about that? And I think that that's really interesting that we use that language, because we're then equating embarrassment with shame. And I think it can be interchangeable in some ways, but I don't know. It's so fascinating to me that when we experience people as lacking embarrassment, as sometimes that doesn't feel genuine either. Like, we can get a sense that sometimes feeling embarrassed is a genuine. There's something genuine about that. There's something kind of sweet about feeling embarrassed. And shamelessness can often appear like a sense of confidence, but it's actually often a defensive structure against deep shame, because rather than feeling too much embarrassment, these individuals feel none. They feel no embarrassment. They pushed it away so effectively, because their psyche really built walls against any possibility of exposure. And so this kind of shameless stance says, you can't humiliate me because I'll humiliate you first, or I'll act as though nothing touches me, or there's nothing you can see of me that I haven't already seen of myself, but it's not really coming out of a confidence. And maybe we can think about it as a reaction formation against shame, turning kind of vulnerability into a sort of a brazenness. There's a flavor of it that doesn't feel genuine. And it's interesting, right? Some people may even seek attention kind of compulsively as a way to control being seen. If I choose to be exposed, I can't be humiliated, or I can't be put down. I'm gonna do it all myself first. And it's a performance, it's a performance as a form of empowerment, but it doesn't create real meaningful kind of connection, because there's a lack of real sense of vulnerability. And why is that? We can think about it as because there's a lack of other. There's an experience of another person's mind as a humiliating other that I now have to defend against. So I'm not really relating to you in your mind as who you are. I'm relating to you with how I think you are. And when we are related to in that way, we can feel that there's not a real connection. And invulnerability is a performance. We are all vulnerable. And so if we're not feeling someone's vulnerability through their brazenness or through their being the class clown, for example, and we think, oh, they're impervious to embarrassment, they're so kind of free of shame. That's not true. They are just really effective defending against it, but it's still coming out of a real brittleness inside, because the sign of like a healthy quote unquote person is not an absence of shame. It's an ability to bear it without collapse. It's an ability to be embarrassed sometimes, because life sometimes is embarrassing, and sometimes we do embarrassing things without moving into it being unthinkable, untouchable, untalkable. Now, it's interesting because some people actually feel drawn towards humiliation, right? Like what's going on there for the people who actually want to be humiliated. And again, I think tend to think of humiliation as the experience, actually experiencing the other as bad. So whereas embarrassment is like maybe we're imagining other people are laughing at us and they are bad, humiliation is actually them saying something bad, them saying you're so stupid, right? You're now being humiliated in front of people. There is now a quality of an intent to bring you down. And I think that that's humiliation. But for some people, humiliation can offer relief. It externalizes what is already felt internally. So rather than diffuse the sense of shame, humiliation can provide a concrete scenario. Now I know why I feel small. Now it's proven why I feel small. I don't have to defend against the feeling of smallness because, see, I do deserve this. In some cases, right, the psyche seeks humiliation as a repetition compulsion, right, as a reenactment of an early dynamic where degradation and powerlessness were linked to love, attention, and safety. That's very confusing. And so there's like a masochistic dimension here, a wish to kind of master shame by inviting it, by creating it. If I can be humiliated, then at least now everything matches how I'm feeling. So clinically, like, we see this in clients who repeatedly put themselves in situations that exposes them, not out of a carelessness, but out of an unconscious hope to finally survive the humiliation differently. That's the repetition compulsion. We hope that this time we're going to experience it differently, or this time we're going to master it, we're going to beat it. It's going to fit how we feel. Somehow now it's going to be different. So in that sense, we can think about humiliation seeking as an unconscious bid for a transformation, right? For an attempt for the psyche to finally metabolize what was unbearable. But it often doesn't work. Repetition compulsions generally don't work. Trying to create something now and having new power over it just keeps the cycle going. Because the way that we master our kind of previous humiliation is by really encountering the feelings within ourselves and bringing words to the feelings, not kind of recreating it all unconsciously. So in my final part here, let's talk about like, how do we move through embarrassment then? You know, if we're thinking about embarrassment as so intertwined with our sense of self, then we can understand that the more fragile our sense of self is, the more embarrassment we're going to feel. So to reclaim embarrassment, or to reclaim our relationship with embarrassment, is really reclaiming the right to be seen imperfectly and to not have that collapse us. It's to allow our kind of humanity to coexist with our dignity, right? And the capacity to tolerate embarrassment is a measure of psychic freedom. When I put my podcast out there, I think some people experience like, how do you do that? How do you just, it's because when I think of doing it, I feel like it's so cringy. How can you do it? And it's like, but you imagine that I don't feel like it's cringy. I do sometimes feel like it's cringy. There are episodes that I'm really embarrassed about, that I wish I hadn't done or wish I'd done differently. I do look back and I'm like, oh my God, I cannot believe I did that. But there's something about that feels more survivable for me than some other types of embarrassment that feel less survivable for me. And so then that's my opportunity to know something about myself, right? Like, why is it that certain cringy moments feel okay and some don't? And you know, again, the invitation is that embarrassment is not something to avoid, but it's something to trust. It's a signal of an aliveness and a participation and a risk taking. And the more that we can expand our capacity to tolerate some levels of embarrassment, not humiliation, embarrassment, we can then, we are in that way kind of working on creating a more robust sense of self. Yeah. So we're not saying that embarrassment is a bad feeling and that it's something that we need to we can't outgrow embarrassment. Embarrassment happens because there's always going to be ways in which we want to protect our image of ourselves. Always. That's the way in which the ego works. There's a sense of self. There's a way that we see ourselves that we protect. And it's okay that we experience forms of embarrassment. But like I said at the beginning, if we're thinking about embarrassment as a social affect, then we get to think about what types of people are we surrounding ourselves with? How much of the past are we projecting onto the people around us? How much of this embarrassment is actually from the past, like Kohut, right? And how much of this is because of how people are relating to us now? Is it embarrassment? Is it humiliation? And if we're being put down now, why are we tolerating that? What part of us feels like maybe we deserve it? So in that way, embarrassment, right, when tolerated and reflected on, can become a gateway to authenticity. And it can show us our narcissistic injuries, right, the places where we are over-invested, and we can think of it that way, in how we appear. And then learning how to stay with this embarrassment, right, rather than collapsing into shame or overcompensating with like a shamelessness, right? That's developing a mature ego function, as Freud would say. That's developing a strong sense of self. So how can we work with embarrassment? Well, we can pause when we're noticing it. We can see what it's like inside of ourselves. We can reflect on it later and ask, like, what part of me felt really seen in that moment? What part of me felt really small and exposed? We can think about, how would I have been related to if this had happened when I was a child? What part of this feels like it's a residue of the past? In relational work, right, in therapy, in friendship, and love, we can try to bring language to our embarrassment. We can talk about it. It felt so soothing to me to have been able to then talk to my husband about that joke and to have him kind of be in it with me in a way that felt surprising, because I thought the only way I would be soothed is if he was to say something like, that wasn't that bad. That wasn't that embarrassed. That you're fine. But that wasn't his truth. He did feel like that joke was inappropriate too. But he was able to empathize by being like, but I do that all the time. And that actually really helped me. It helped develop more strength of like, this is survivable. And I don't now need to go to all the people and be like, is that okay? Is that okay? Is that? I can trust that, like, if somebody had a problem with it, they would let me know. But if they didn't, but like, we can also move on from that. And I can still kind of feel more cohesive in myself. Yeah. So true self-esteem, isn't the absence of embarrassment, but it's the capacity to bear it, right? And to get curious about it when it shows up. So, my kind of homework for you all is to think about, like, when was the last time you felt embarrassed? What image of yourself was threatened in that moment? Whose gaze did you imagine when you see the people that you felt embarrassed in front of? Who were you really? Was it really them? Was it something about the past, your mom, your dad, your grandfather? Like, who were you really imagining was gazing at you? What part of you felt exposed? And what might that reveal about your desire to connect, your desire for belonging, your desire for acceptance, And remember, embarrassment is not a failure. It's evidence that you're trying to relate, to try to kind of show yourself, to live beyond control. Embarrassment reminds us that we're human, and that being human is inherently a little messy. It's a little exposed. It's completely necessary for growth. Embarrassment is a sign of our vitality, as long as we're not so afraid of it that we don't ever take risks. Learning how to hold it so that we can take risks, so that we can risk other people embarrassing us, and knowing that we're going to survive and we can talk about it, is part of what allows our lives to feel just a little bit more vital. So thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you being here. If you have any input into what topics you would love for me to cover, feel free to email me at info@thaissky.com. I absolutely love receiving your feedback, comment, share, do all the things. The algorithm loves it. And if you want another episode, I'm going to put here the episode on shame, because shame and embarrassment really go hand in hand. So if you want to check out the whole Reclaiming What is Hard episode on shame, you can go right here. Catch you next time.